Okay, in this video we're going to talk about the Reformation. So there are dozens of Christian denominations in the world today. We have Presbyterians, Seventh-day Adventists, Congregationalists, Baptists, Methodists, Quakers, and more. So where did they all come from? Well, in the early 16th century, a German monk accidentally started a religious revolution. His name was Martin Luther, the one that's pictured there. And the revolution today is what we call the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation was a movement that is going to seek to correct the abuses and introduce reform into the Catholic Church. Ultimately, the Reformation is going to lead to a split within the Catholic Church, and it will result in the establishment of Protestantism. We'll look at some essential questions that we're going to attempt to answer in this video series. So number one, there had been movements to reform the Catholic Church in previous centuries, and we've talked about some of these in class. Why did the protests this time result in the upheaval that we call the Reformation? Number two, why is it so crucial to Luther and other Reformation leaders to stress salvation by grace and faith alone and to downplay what they call works? Number three, why were many Reformation leaders opposed to such things as decorations, images, and elaborate rituals in religious services, even in some cases church music? And number four, why did the Reformation quickly split into many sects instead of uniting around Luther's ideas or those of some other key figure? Why were these Protestant sects often hostile to one another as to the Catholic Church? Number five, in what ways did secular princes and monarchs take advantage of the Reformation to boost their own power and authority? What effect did the Reformation have on the rising power of the nation-state? And number six, how did the Catholic Church respond to the challenge of the Reformation? In what way was the response a defensive one of trying to prevent all change, and in what ways did the Church respond positively and actually make some changes of its own? Okay, those are the questions we're going to attempt to answer through this video series. So the first one, the events leading to the Reformation. Well, the prestige of the church had been damaged in the Middle Ages, both by political and theological conflicts. And in the early 14th century, political concerns leads Pope Clement V to move the papacy to the French border in the town of Avignon, where it's going to remain until Pope Gregory VI moves it back to Rome in 1371. So when Gregory dies, the French dislike the Vatican's choice to replace him as pope and are going to decide to choose a pope of their own. So in 1417, there are going to be two popes ruling simultaneously, one in Rome and one in Avignon. So the different rulers of the time supported one pope or the other for political reasons, and this is called the Great Schism. It's only going to last a relatively short amount of time, but it still undermines the authority of the church. And during the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the leadership of the Catholic Church is going to become increasingly focused on more secular concerns like accumulating property and profit-making enterprises. Various popes, monks, and clergymen are going to break their vows of chastity and poverty. For example, Pope Alexander VI, a scion of the powerful Borgia family, had several mistresses and regularly granted land and special papal privileges to his relatives. Intellectual developments during the Renaissance also provide society with a more secular view and an increased focus on the value of the individual. Remember, that was one of the things we emphasized in the Renaissance. What became important was the value of the individual. So the humanist movement that arises in Italy in the second half of the 15th century emphasizes the study of classical works from ancient Greece and Rome as a means to truly fulfill one's intellectual and moral potential. And as this movement spreads off to the north, an offshoot of it, known as Christian humanism, is going to develop. And this Christian humanism, it stresses fulfilling one's spiritual potential. So Christian humanists are going to seek to reform the church from the ground up. And they're going to urge each person to strive every day to live a pious, good life. The most famous Christian humanist was Dutch scholar Desiderius Erasmus, who in 1509 writes a book called In the Praise of Folly, which is a satirical novel, and in it he's going to criticize the excesses and the corruption of the church. So we have early calls for reform on the church, and we've talked about these in class, John Wycliffe and John Huss. So prior to Luther, others who had called on the church to institute reform are going to set the stage for our Reformation. John Wycliffe lives from 1328 to 1384, and Huss lives from 1369 to 1415. Both are ultimately going to be labeled as heretics by the church, and as a result of their calls for change. So Wycliffe had questioned the authority of the Pope, and he stressed the role of faith and personal scripture reading. He was condemned and forced to live out the rest of his life in a monastery. Huss is going to be burned at the stake as a result of this label heretic for criticizing the clergy and denouncing the Pope as the Antichrist. Huss taught that ordinary people could reform the church. In this picture, you're going to see many important leaders of the Reformation. On the front row, from left to right, we have Philip Melanchthon, Martin Luther, Jan Hus. In the middle row, we have John Calvin, Gustavus Adolphus, and Ulrich Zwingli. And on the top row, you have Bugenhagen and Ulrich von Hutten. There's some other reformers that aren't listed here, Henry VIII of England, and leaders of the Catholic Counter-Reformation that we're going to talk about towards the end. So, what was this Reformation over? Indulgences technically didn't provide forgiveness. Instead, they were supposed to lessen or eliminate the earthly penalty for sin, which people usually addressed by doing penance or some other prescribed work. The church used the following logic to justify indulgences. Since the saints had performed more good deeds than they needed to get into heaven, an excess of good exists. And the Pope, therefore, could distribute these extra good works to people in order to pardon either their own sin or the sin of a family member who is in purgatory. So technically, the church claimed that indulgences were not sold, instead they were given at the time to a person who made a donation to the church. And the practical reality, however, was that the indulgences could generate a great deal of cash for the church. That's going to bring us to the end of this brief discussion, and we're going to continue this in a series of videos. So if you'll look at these discussion questions and kind of reflect on them, write your answers down. If you have any questions about them, let me know in class so we can answer those. Question number 1 says, some of the great wealth and power of the Catholic Church corrupted it and led it to abandon the true spirit of Christian teachings. Others say it was more the growing wealth and power of kings and secular states that weakened the authority and prestige of the church. Do you think one of these factors is more important than the other? Why or why not? Number 2, why might the humanism of the Renaissance have led educated people to question the power and authority of the Pope more than they had been the case in the past? And number 3, the Reformation was triggered by outrage over indulgences. Why do you think it was a specific issue that began the Reformation?